What is a pivot chart? Well, basically a pivot chart is a chart based on pivot data. If we take some sample data, as we have here in our sales 2015 file, and we wanted to create a pivot table to summarize that data, we could then create a chart based on that summary. Alternatively, we could create a chart straight from the outset. If we know our end result here, our end target is to create a chart on this data, then we can create a pivot chart straight away. The mechanics are, go to the Insert ribbon. Make sure you're somewhere in your data. You don't need to highlight it, you just need to be in it, as long as there are no fully blank columns, otherwise Excel won't spot where the end of the data is. And we're interested in pivot chart, so we come all the way across the charts, and then pivot chart has its own little section. A little drop down arrow to choose either pivot chart or pivot chart and pivot table. Now, in reality, there is very little difference between doing the two, because even if we choose pivot chart, as we're going to, asks me to confirm where the data is, and it's highlighted it all. Fantastic. Okay. We get a pivot table here on the left and our pivot chart in the middle. Whatever we do will happen in both. The chart is pretty much linked to a pivot table. Let's take the date and place that in the axes. And you can see here it then splits into months, which is fine. That works for me. And then let's take the sales and drop that in the values. And then we get the default, obviously again, columns for my chart. Now, the difference between a pivot chart and a normal chart is it is linked to the pivot table, therefore linked to the data. So it is a summary chart. You'll see here we have sum of sales because that's what's happening in the middle of the pivot table. It's quite useful to have the pivot table there, isn't it? And we have the grouping that is taking place month and date. And you can see here in the pivot table, if you expand out January, it gives you the individual dates, and carrying out that expansion also expands the chart out. Let's compress that. And these little blocks stay on the chart at all times, except for when we hide them, which is a little bit down the line. But apart from that, it works and behaves just like a normal chart. When I click on here, I get the same chart options. So I've got all these chart styles. I can change the color scheme. I can change the chart type. I might want to change that into line for sales. And I can do any of the formatting that we could do with a normal chart. So the design and the format ribbons are pretty much the same. We just have an extra sub ribbon here, which allows us to interrogate the data, but that's effectively the same as the pivot table. That's method one. It works. You can see here on the right, you still have your pivot chart field, and we can move things around. Perhaps I don't want to do the sum of sales, I want to do the quantities. And the chart responds. Or I want to do sales, I'd like to do average of sales. So June was seriously high average. Or I want to put quantity back in, and perhaps I'd like to put country into the series option. So here in the table, that's the columns, this is the rows. In a chart, this is the series and this is the category. You can see here you now have a separate line for Germany, Scotland, United Kingdom. But the values for Germany and Scotland are single ones in 2 of the months. They're not getting graphed very visibly. Let's perhaps change this into a column chart. In which case the columns now appear because it's just a single month that you have a value in. There's your German value and there's your Scotland value, and the rest are all United Kingdom. Perhaps if I took the date options out, then just have a bar for each country. So if you bear in mind that this top section is exactly the same as in its pivot table, in that this is the series, or in the table that controls the columns, and here are the categories, so I could move the country into there, and they control the rows. In my chart, they're classed as category and series, and depending on the chart type will depend on how things are then displayed. The middle section here is where the calculations take place, so that controls, in this case, the size of the column, or the relative size of the column, or the height of the line if we're up in a line chart. Now, there is an alternative way of creating a pivot chart, and that is simply to start with your data, actually add a pivot table. Don't even think about charts for the moment. That creates me a pivot table into which I can place the options. So perhaps put the countries down here, sales in the middle, and the months across the top. Once I've got my pivot table working as I see fit, I simply then just click into the pivot table and use our magic keyboard shortcut of F11, and that will create me the pivot chart. Notice by doing things this route, we end up with separate sheets. We had a separate sheet that gets inserted for the pivot table, and then a separate sheet that gets inserted for the pivot chart. But they both work together. Be a little bit aware of that. If I take months out of here, which is on my legend, notice that the pivot table also has the months removed. that this pivot table is linked to the base data. The chart is linked to the pivot table. So any changes I make in the pivot chart will affect the pivot table. So just be a little bit aware of that. When you have both in an Excel workbook and you're changing the fields or the columns or the actual values on any one of those, so either on the chart or the pivot table, that the other item will respond to those changes as well, because they are inextricably linked to each other. But other than that, as long as you keep that in mind, creating a pivot chart is really very straightforward and very useful as a graphical summary of your data, other than just having a table summary.